Okay, everybody awake? Okay, Liberty ships. This is mostly about Liberty ships, but also it has a lot to do with how a U.S. industrial output helped win the war, because we were the primary provider of all medical, or not medical, military equipment, not only for U.S. Military, but also for our allies, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, a temporary ally, if I might add, the UK. And the idea was, as it says there, quantity, not quality. The idea was if you can build something box-like that we can put stuff in and get it over to wherever it's needed, and if it will last at least 5 years, and if we can build enough of them, we just might win the war. So basically, that's what, if you could think of it as sort of a container that floats. You know, the containers they put on ships now and then put on trucks, but basically that's what they were. And if you want to compare war production in World War I to World War II, I'd mentioned this in an earlier lecture, because we had no intention of getting involved in World War I, and there were no years of preparation before we actually did get involved. We've pretty much got sucked into it. Woodrow Wilson was trying to stay out of it. He succeeded right up until 1917. And then we did declare war on Germany. We didn't really have the wherewithal to help out much. That's when we started constructing planes and ships and stuff, like the submarines, the S-boats. We didn't start building those until after we declared war on Germany. And by the time most of them were commissioned, the war was already over. And most of the U.S. troops, when they went and fought in Europe, they were using French and British equipment. But in the case of World War II, we were getting ready in the 1930s, even though President Roosevelt declared he was not going to get sucked into another European war. But he knew that there was a possibility of it. And even though the majority of Americans did not want to get involved in another foreign conflict, they did have a lot of sympathy for the French and the British and the others who had been invaded by Nazi Germany. So Congress started appropriating funds so that we could start building more ships and planes, and they instituted the draft by 1940. A lot of what we were producing, like I said, was going to our allies. And then when we did get involved in the war, our production had pretty much turned over for wartime purposes. And the U-boats were sinking British merchant ships 3 times faster than they could be replaced. This is as of March 1941, well before Pearl Harbor. And damaged ships, even before we got in the war, some of the damaged ships were coming into U.S. shipyards for repair, because the UK shipyards were working overtime. They were trying to produce warships. They didn't really have the wherewithal for producing a cargo vessels such as the Liberty ships, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So the Americans, even before Pearl Harbor, were trying to help out by taking in some damaged warships and trying to repair them in U.S. yards. And like I said, in the UK, they were not only building warships, but they were working overtime trying to repair damaged ships that were coming in. And in April 1941, of course, this is still well before Pearl Harbor, the United States decided to extend their American security zone to the 26th meridian. This allowed U.S. vessels to escort convoys as far as that point, and then UK vessels would pick them up here and escort them the rest of the way. And eventually, President Roosevelt issued a shoot-on-sight order if they did come across an enemy submarine. Even though we were not at war with them, the president gave U.S. ships and planes permission to attack them. Likewise, U-boats had fired torpedoes at a number of U.S. warships. One of them was the Reuben B. James, was actually sunk. I think another destroyer, maybe a destroyer or two, had been torpedoed but not sunk. I did an oral history interview who was on the USS Yorktown when it was in the Atlantic prior to Pearl Harbor. And according to him, a U-boat actually fired a torpedo at the USS Yorktown, but fortunately missed. I'm going to talk about some people you've never heard of, because they were not actively involved in the war in the sense of being involved in the fighting. such as people like Admiral Halsey or Admiral Spruance. But these are people who were working behind the scenes. They were not getting a lot of headlines, but they were certainly important to carrying out the war. One of them was Robert Thompson. He was involved in a family-owned shipbuilding company in the UK. They're the ones that got the idea that, you know what, if we're going to win this war, we're going to have to find somebody to help us build ships. Now, initially, they wanted cargo ships, which eventually would be called the Liberty ship. So he was actually sent over to the United States well before Pearl Harbor. It was the British Merchant Shipbuilders Commission, and they went over with plans for the type of cargo ship they would like the Americans to build for them so that they could replace some of their losses, because they were incapable of replacing all the ships that they were losing in the early years of the war. So he got over there and met with a few people and actually got the number of people to sign contracts to build these Liberty ships. And then he got on a ship and headed back to England, and a U-boat sunk the ship he was on. So he had this briefcase full of all these important contracts. He ended up in a boat in the water for 9 hours before he was rescued, and then they took all these contracts, and they got to England, they had to dry them out. But he was very important in convincing the Americans to help out in that way. And I'm going to get into that a little bit further. Here's somebody else who was very important to the war effort. Anybody ever heard of Admiral E.S. Land? Nobody's heard of him? Well, he graduated from the University of Wyoming, had a degree there, and after that he applied and got accepted to the U.S. Naval Academy. So he had 2 degrees by the time he was commissioned in the U.S. Navy, and his specialty was design and construction of Navy ships, and he was the one who was involved in the design and building of the S-boats that were supposed to be used in World War I. Like I said, though, most of them weren't even completed until the war was over. And those were the submarines that we had on the eve of our entry into World War II, and most of them were 20 years older or older and considered obsolete. But as I said in an earlier lecture, at least the torpedoes they were using on the S-boats worked much better than the ones that were designed for the newer fleet boats that came out later in the late 30s and early 40s. But he was one of the people that the Merchant Marine Commission had contacted. And these are the designs we have. They all look the same. They're almost like Legos. You know, we build part of it here, we build part of it there, we lay down the keel, and then we just take all these parts and weld them together, and bingo, you've got yourself a Liberty ship. And he didn't think they were very good designs. He thought that U.S. shipyards should not build ships that were only expected to last 5 years. He wanted something that was going to last till well after the war. But eventually he came around. The British convinced him that this is the best way to go. Build them quick, build them cheap, and get them as many out there as possible. And if we can start building more than the Germans can sink, then we have a chance of winning the war. Here's somebody else. Anybody ever hear of W.S. Knutson, Big Bill Knutson? Anybody ever hear of him? Okay, there's a couple of people. Okay, that's very good. I mean, he was born and raised in Denmark. He never went to college. I think he went to a couple of technical schools. His father, I guess they didn't believe in birth control in Denmark in those days because he was one of 10 children, and the way his father would feed his children as soon as they were old enough, and that was in grade school, to send them out to work. So as he was in grade school, he was sent out to try to make a few pennies here and there to help support the family. As he got older, though, while he was working during the day, he was going to a trade school at night. He got involved in the bicycle business because that's before automobiles. So bicycles were all the rage in Denmark and other parts of the world. So he got involved in building bicycles when he was still a teenager. He was well known in Denmark even as a teenager because he invented the tandem bicycle. But he just thought he had dreams, and he just thought there were limitations on those dreams if he stayed in Denmark. So he was either 20 or 21 years old with all of his possessions in a suitcase, and I think he said $36 in his pocket. He landed in the U.S., went to work almost immediately in one of the shipyards in New Jersey. I guess he had a another brother who followed him over there and was involved in the bicycle business there in the States. So he started working with his brother in bicycles, but then Henry Ford came along and they started building automobiles. So whatever they were doing with bicycles, they started manufacturing parts for new Ford cars. To make a long story short, Henry Ford liked what he saw about W.S. Knudsen, even though he was just working, menial labor. He was learning as he went along. He ended up being very high up in Ford automobile production until Henry Ford fired him. He got so good that Henry Ford felt threatened by him. So he went over to General Motors and started working at General Motors and eventually became the head of General Motors. He was self-taught, just like Bill Gates and some of our more contemporaries. He never went to university. At one time, he was talking to a colleague about maybe going to Cornell and getting a degree in engineering, and his colleague says, "What do you want to do with that? You know more about engineering than any of those professors over there." So here he was heading up General Motors. Then the war came along, and the president called him, and he says, "I want to put you in charge of the Office of Production Management." And Knudsen says, "Well, what does that entail?" And the president said, "I don't know. You figure it out." So, and here's the thing. Here's the guy. He's never had any military experience. He didn't go to West Point. Didn't have a university degree. And once he got showing what he could do in the Office of Production Management, that they actually made him a 3-star general in the United States Army. I mean, there are people who go to West Point, and after 20 or 30 years, if they come out as a colonel or brigadier general, they're doing pretty good. And this guy, he had to learn English. When he got to the United States, he had to learn English after he got here. So he had a very strong Danish accent. So he was put in charge of this production. And basically what he did, he spent the whole war just going around from one plant to another, trying to help them figure out some of the bottlenecks they were getting to. And he would just say things like in the B-29 plant, well, you got to have this ready on the right, you have this ready on the left, and you do that all the way up the line, and then you bring in the fuselage of the B-29, and you start attaching things as they go, and when you get in line, you should have a finished B-29. That's just giving a rough example of what he did. But he went around to aircraft factories and other plants where they were having problems with production. They're getting these bottlenecks, and the final product was not as good as it should be. And he just went around and tried to correct all these things. And he was a micromanager in a sense. He would even walk through the parking lots where some of these plants, and if he saw a car that had a broken headlight, he says, your priority is make sure he gets that headlight fixed. And if he'd see a car that had bald tires, he says, they have priority on tires, because if you have workers who can't get to work because of a flat tire or some other car problems, you're going to slow down the war effort. That's how into it he was. And he did that right up to the end of the war. I think he probably really exhausted himself, because as soon as the war was over, he was retired and he was dead 3 years later. Now there are some people who will argue that he was probably the second most powerful man in the United States after Franklin Roosevelt, because what he did was so important to the war effort in the sense that he got all the bottlenecks out of productions and plants all over the country. Now, like I said, most people have never heard of this guy, but in Denmark, they know about this guy, even though he spent most of his adult life in the United States. And matter of fact, when I gave this lecture some years ago, there was a couple from Denmark who came up after my lecture and said that at that time they were making a movie about Knudsen in Denmark. So even though all the important work he did during the war was done in the United States, and that's where he spent most of his adult life, we don't know much about him, but the Danes do. I love this quote from him. He says, when you go to Europe, they show you something that belonged to King Canute. When you go to America, they show you something they're going to build. That's how he compared his native country to the United States. Now, there's nobody here who's never heard of Henry Kaiser, right? All right, you've all heard of him? Okay, just want to make sure. Anyway, but he's another guy. He was a self-made man. He didn't have a university education. He started off selling cameras and developing film. Then he went out to Oregon, worked in a hardware store for a while. Then during World War I, he started building roads in Canada and the United States. He didn't know how to build roads, but he knew how to find people who knew how to build roads. And he was an organizer, an administrator, and he had all sorts of ambition, and he was a workaholic. So he would hire people and say, okay, we're going to build roads in Canada. I'm going to hire you and you and you. Now do it. And that's where his genius stopped. He got other people to do the work for him. He just made sure that they found work. Then during the Depression, he got involved in building dams under the Roosevelt administration, Grand Coulee dams and things like that. And then when that Merchant Marine Commission came over from England, he went and found, I can't even remember his name now, from England. And they started talking, and he says, well, I can build roads and I can build dams. I should certainly be able to build ships. And just based on that, he got a contract to build Liberty ships. But first of all, he had to find a place to build them. There weren't enough shipyards in the United States, especially on the West Coast. So he started building the facilities in Portland and also in the San Francisco Bay Area, namely Richmond. And Richmond at that time was little more than mudflats. And that's where he built his shipyards. He went to see how solid the ground was there on the mudflats, so he sent a bulldozer out there, which immediately sank out of sight. And so they had to build it on piles. They had piles 70 feet high, and they were pounding them in something like 200 a day. And the ship building area in Richmond was all built on wooden piles. And so he was starting to produce Liberty ships. And later he says, well, how about aircraft carriers? You need some more aircraft carriers? Okay, I can do that too. But one of his sons had a degree in engineering, and he worked with his father as long as he lived. And like I said, he would go find these guys with engineering or other skills, and then he would hire them. One of them he hired was Clay Bedford, right out of university, and I'm not sure which one is Edgar and which one is Clay in there, but he hired him, and he worked most of his working life, too, for Kaiser on various projects. But one of them would work on the shipyards in Portland, the other one was down in Richmond. It was almost a contest to see who could build the ships the fastest. And I'll give you some ideas of that. Oh, okay, we have... this is something else I have to tell you about. Most of the time, ships were built with rivets. Okay, rivets takes time to teach somebody how to be a riveter, and you have to be strong. And rivets use up a lot of steel, and there was a steel shortage, among other things, during the war. So when the commission came over from England, they can try to convince Land and the others that, look, at riveting just not going to work. It's going to take up too much steel. It's going to take too much time to train the right people to do it. And so they convinced them to try welding instead of using rivets. So, you hear about Rosie the Riveter. I think really she should be called Rosie the Welder, because I don't know of any women who learned how to do riveting. They were all taught how to weld. And you could teach somebody how to weld faster than you could teach somebody how to be a riveter. But some of those welders, even they were teaching them on the job training, and some of them were a little bit better than others. Some of them could do a better weld than others, and I guess it depends on how fast you learn and your skill level as to how well those Liberty ships are going to hold together. But U.S. built 2/3 of all the Allied military equipment during the war, which came to almost 6,000 Liberty ships, okay? So we were replacing the ones that were being sunk, and we were replacing faster than the U-boats could sink them. And like I said, there was a steel shortage, and there was a shortage of a lot of other things during the war. So a lot of these shipyards, they were all built of wood. And I read that even some of the cranes that you see there, at least part of them were made from wood, just to conserve on the use of steel. And I found this hard to believe, and I'm not sure if it's 100% true, but those Liberty ships supposedly had no electricity, no running water, and no ventilation. I don't know, that's pretty rough. It's not something you're going to experience on a cruise ship. But like I said, there were shortages of steel, shortages of a lot of things. And of course, the unions, even though it was wartime, the coal miners went on strike, and some of the other unions went on strike, and that slowed down production, at least for a while during the war. USS Patrick Henry, that was the first Liberty ship launched, and that was in September 1941. So as you can see, we were building Liberty ships even before Pearl Harbor. And 5 vessels were finished by the end of 1941, just right. So by the time of Pearl Harbor, we had produced 5 vessels in U.S. shipyards, but into 42, 55 were built in 1942, and then by 1944, 50 Liberty ships were being launched every day. Okay, I don't think you could do that today. It was a year or so ago that the Australian government announced that they were going to buy some nuclear submarines. Okay, this is because of the threat from China, and but then I read later though that they won't be ready until 2040. So building a nuclear submarine is a little bit different than building a Liberty ship back during World War II. And this is the SS Robert E. Peary. It was put together in 5 days, from the time the keel was laid until it was finished product. But this was a publicity stunt. I mean, they had all their Tinker toys all lined up and ready before they fired off the starting pistol, and then they were working 24 hours a day and got the thing finished in 5 days, but they didn't try to duplicate that. That was just sort of a publicity stunt. And then, has anybody ever heard of boats made of cement? Yeah, have been to Santa Cruz? There's an old cement Liberty ship that was running aground there at some time, I guess after the war. When I was a kid, we used to go out there and play on it and go fishing off the end of it. But because of all the storms and stuff over the years, it's pretty much broken up, at least the last time I was out there. But they did make ships out of ferroconcrete. And then they had the armed guards. Now, people working in the merchant navy, they were unionized, so they got very good salaries during the war. But to protect those merchant ships, they have 5-inch 38s anti-aircraft guns, and they were manned by U.S. Navy personnel who were making much less than the guys working as merchant mariners. It did cause some friction in certain cases. Now, there was a problem, too, with brittle fractures. Some of these Liberty ships literally developed cracks in certain parts of the ships, and several of them actually broke in half and sank. A number of people were killed. So they thought, well, they're using a thinner, cheaper type of steel, and the welding was not always as good as it might have been. So they started using rivets in certain places, like around hatch covers where there's a lot of tension, and they would strengthen those by using rivets. And this is just the only diagram I could find to throw up there. So people who are into this, maybe it makes more sense to you. Now, I'm not a metallurgist. I don't know anything about welding. So I couldn't understand about the fracturing part very well, but a lot of times after I give a lecture, people who do come forward and try to enlighten me a bit. One person told me that a lot of the fracturing took place in some of the colder climates, like in the North Atlantic. And he said, this person that I talked to said they got around this in a way by heating the 2 sheets of metal, heating them up before actually welding them, and that was supposed to help. But then somebody else told me that the welding rods that they were using, there was something that was in the welding rods that created bubbles in the weld as you made the weld. I don't know what it was, but the person says after the war they used different types of welding rods to prevent these bubbles from forming. I guess you could say a weld is as strong as its biggest bubble. And then after the war, they were used for a variety of purposes. Of course, a lot of American moms and dads didn't want their sons to be interred overseas, especially in some of these out-of-the-way Pacific islands. So a lot of them were exhumed and brought back to the United States, and the Liberty ships were used to do that. And also they had Operation Magic Carpet. Since the war was finally over, people wanted to go home. They didn't want to be stuck overseas for any length of time. So they're using Liberty ships as well as other type of ships, and they were welding bunks all over the place. Even in aircraft carriers, they had bunks inside the hangar bay, trying to get the guys home as fast as they could. And this is on the Thames River near London, but there was a Liberty ship that was sunk there during the war. It was full of ammunition. And when I was reading about that, they said if they ever tried to salvage that ship or get rid of all the explosives that are down there, they'd have to evacuate about 20,000 people in the area. And they were only supposed to last about 5 years, but some of these Liberty ships actually were in use for 20 years after the war. Some foreign companies bought them. Maybe they did some reconfiguration, or maybe they strengthened some of the welding in some of these ships, but some of them actually sailed for about 20 years after the war. And remember, they were only supposed to last 5 years. But this one is in San Francisco Bay, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, and I guess it still goes out. People can go out there and take a tour and actually go out to sea on those. And I have to talk about civilian casualties because in an earlier lecture, I mentioned that we lost around 400,000 Americans killed in World War II, but that doesn't count the number of people who died in industrial accidents, okay? They didn't have a lot of safety concerns back then like they do now. And the information I got, that there were about 85,000 civilians, mostly who got killed in industrial accidents. And at General Motors alone, 189 senior executives died during the war. I think a lot of it had to do with just the stress of the day. These people were putting in long hours. They were under a lot of pressure. They had deadlines. They smoked Camel unfilters. They cooked with lard. I remember my kid. Do you remember Crisco in a can? Yeah, that's what we cooked everything, Crisco. I wonder how many lives were shortened that way. But at General Motors alone. And now I've come across, I'm always very suspicious of figures that I come across in terms of numbers of how many soldiers were here, how many were killed there, how many wounded. Because I don't know, I get mixed numbers sometimes. And I had read in other sources that the number of civilians who died in industrial accidents in World War II was even higher than that. So I'm just going to use that number. I don't know how exact it is. But anyway, that's my son telling me this lecture is over. And I don't have a lecture tomorrow. Is that because it's Super Bowl? No? Oh, it is? Okay, so I don't know. I don't have a lecture tomorrow. I thought that might be the reason, but maybe not. But then the day after, I have another lecture, and that'll be my last lecture of the cruise. So anyway, see you later.